You're not welcome here, Colleen. This is a private event for family. That's what my daughter-in-law said as she stood between me and my husband's memorial service. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, I just stood there, in full uniform, in silence. And then, 12 Marines appeared, marching in step straight toward me. Their commander removed his hat, saluted, and said, "Lieutenant General Colleen Barrett, ma'am. We're here to honor your husband's service. And yours. My name is Colleen Barrett. I served this country for nearly 4 decades, but the hardest battle I ever faced was in my own family. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about the moment silence spoke louder than shame, and truth stood at attention. Let me tell you what happened before that day, and everything that came after. I remember the weight of his hand in mine that night. It was the last time I ever felt truly seen. Raymond didn't say much. Not at the end. But he didn't need to. We had built our lives around the unspoken. In the soft hum of the monitors and the steady click of the IV drip, I sat beside him in silence, my hand resting lightly over his. I could still feel the roughness of his fingers, the same hands that once saluted in sync with mine all those years ago. He blinked slowly as if to say, "It's okay. You don't have to hold it all anymore." And I whispered, "I've got it, Ray. I'll carry it home." That was our last conversation. No fanfare, no dramatic goodbye. Just 2 soldiers bound by love letting go in the only language we'd ever needed. Quiet strength. The morning he passed, the world around me seemed to freeze, but the practicalities of death moved fast. There were arrangements, phone calls, people trying to be helpful. I tried to brace myself for the grief, but nothing prepared me for the message that arrived the next day. It was from my son Nathan. "Mom," the text read, "Alyssa thinks it's best you skip the funeral. It's going to be a private event." Private. Private as in, you're not invited. The funeral of the man I had loved for 42 years. The man I'd buried pieces of myself beside in combat zones and hospital waiting rooms. The father of my only child. Private. At first, I thought I'd misread it. My hands were trembling too much to type a response. I just stared at the screen, waiting for the words to change. But they didn't. And neither did the silence that followed. I tried calling Nathan. He didn't pick up. I sat in my small apartment for hours that day, still in my uniform from the night before, not because I forgot to change, but because I couldn't bring myself to. It felt like shedding the last layer of who I was with him. That uniform had always meant something to Raymond. He never let a birthday go by without thanking me for my service. Even when others treated me like I was just a woman in the military, he reminded me I was more. And now that same uniform had apparently become too much for my own son's wife. I shouldn't have been surprised. Alyssa had always been careful about appearances. At their wedding, she'd pulled me aside and said, smiling through her teeth, "I know it's meaningful for you, but could you not wear the full uniform? It kinda intimidates people, and it'll clash with the color palette." The color palette. I remember standing there with my perfectly pressed dress blues suddenly reduced to a decorative inconvenience. I wore a gray shawl and a navy blouse instead. I smiled in all the photos, even the ones where I was half out of frame. Even the one where I was cropped out entirely when the wedding album was printed. Raymond had noticed. He said nothing at the time, but later that night when everyone else was dancing and I was helping the staff clear tables, he looked at me and whispered, "They don't know who you are." He was wrong. They did know. They just didn't care. Nathan used to care. Before the career, before the marriage, before the house with the 2 fireplaces and the designer dog. He used to run into my arms in full sprint when I returned from deployment, sobbing into my camo sleeves because he was just glad I was alive. I used to think that kind of love was permanent. But somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, that love became conditional, tied to approval, tied to Alyssa's carefully curated version of success. I stayed quiet for years. I watched as Alyssa gradually redefined what family meant in our lives. She started planning holidays without me introducing me to new friends as Nathan's mom. She used to be in the military, like it was a phase I'd grown out of. When I brought up my time overseas, the conversation changed. When I showed up with gifts that weren't brand name, they were politely placed aside. Still, I never said a word. I didn't want to make waves. I didn't want to make it harder for Nathan. I told myself they're building their life. You've already had yours. But nothing prepared me for being shut out of the one moment that mattered most. Saying goodbye. The day of the funeral, I dressed in full uniform. Not out of spite, not to prove anything. Just because I knew that's what Raymond would have wanted. He used to say, "You look strongest in that suit, like the world knows better than to underestimate you." So I put it on. I pinned every metal polished, every button smoothed, every crease. And I drove to the church. It was a small stone chapel, the same one we'd been married in all those years ago. I stood beneath the iron archway, watching through stained glass as people I hadn't seen in decades entered, laughing and hugging, holding tissues like props. I wasn't on the list. There was no seat saved for me. I wasn't allowed inside. I stood outside for the entire service. The wind was sharp, cutting through my gloves. The rain came down later, soaking my shoulders, but I didn't move. Not because I hoped they'd let me in. I knew they wouldn't. But because I needed to stand there. I needed to bear witness to the life we'd shared, even if no one else acknowledged it. I saw Nathan for a brief moment through the window. He stood next to Alyssa, looking straight ahead, never once turning to the door. They didn't lower their voices. "Someone said I thought his wife would be here." Alyssa answered, "She's outside. It's complicated." No, it wasn't. It was simple. I was no longer welcome, not just in the church, but in the family I had helped build, sacrificed for, defended, even when it broke my heart. The ceremony ended. People poured out with murmurs of sympathy and plans for brunch. No one looked at me. No one stopped. I stood motionless in my uniform, rainwater trailing down my collar boots, planted firmly on the ground. In that moment, I didn't feel like a widow. I felt like a ghost. And maybe I had been for years. Only now they had stopped pretending they saw me at all. They never knew. Not really. Not what I had seen. Not what I had done. Not who I had been before I became invisible in my own family. There are parts of my story I never spoke aloud. Not because I was ashamed, but because there was no one to tell who would understand. And maybe because some things, when shared, only get dismissed, diluted, diminished by people who haven't lived them. Years ago, long before I was a mother-in-law kept out of family group texts, I stood in a tent under the blistering sun of a Middle Eastern desert, issuing orders while explosions echoed just a few hills away. We were part of a rapid response unit, tasked with assessing humanitarian fallout after an unexpected raid on a civilian village. What we found was worse than anyone had reported. Entire families trapped behind crumbling walls, children too dehydrated to cry. Supplies had been delayed, and the few local aid workers were overwhelmed. Our orders were clear. Observe, report, don't engage directly. But standing there, watching a father try to dig his daughter out with his bare hands while our convoy waited for the next set of permissions, something inside me snapped into clarity. I radioed command, told them the situation was deteriorating faster than anticipated. They told me to hold. I didn't. I rerouted our medical unit, deployed our emergency shelter kits, and ordered 2 vehicles to start evacuating women and children immediately. It was chaos. Loud, fast, dangerous. But in the end, we moved over 200 civilians to safety. No lives lost on our watch that day. But in the aftermath, I was pulled into a cold, windowless room stateside and handed a folder marked confidential. Inside were the revised after-action reports. My name wasn't in them. Not once. The narrative had shifted. The rescue was noted, the outcomes praised, but the operation was credited to unidentified Allied action. When I asked why I was told you disobeyed protocol, you made a political decision. You're lucky we're not recommending charges. I was a decorated officer one week and a ghost the next. I'd broken the chain of command to do the right thing, and for that I had to be erased. I never told Raymond all of it. He knew enough. Enough to say, you did the right thing, even if they didn't see it. That was always enough for me. He respected what I stood for, even when no one else did. But the rest of the family, they didn't care to ask. They never wanted to understand why I was gone so much, why I kept photos of soldiers I'd served with, tucked into the back of the kitchen drawer, why I kept my hair short even in retirement. They preferred their version of me, the cold woman with rigid posture and sharp tone. The one who ran her home like a barracks, they'd say. I overheard Nathan once back when he was dating Alyssa. She's a little intense, he laughed. Still talks like she's in command. I never corrected him. Maybe because I was too tired. Maybe because I thought he'd grow out of it. But the truth is, Nathan had been raised mostly by Raymond. I was deployed when he took his first steps, when he lost his first tooth, when he broke his arm falling from a tree. It was Raymond who taught him how to ride a bike, how to ask for what he needed, how to calm down when the world felt too loud. I always felt guilty for that, but Raymond never let me spiral. He'd say, "You're fighting a different kind of battle. For all of us." Still, I knew that gap was there, and Alyssa widened it. From the moment she entered our lives, she began to reshape the narrative. She didn't do it maliciously. No, she did it with soft, smiling comments that sounded polite but stung just the same. She's very structured, isn't she? I bet she doesn't do hugs. I think Nathan needs someone who understands emotions better. It wasn't long before I was the afterthought in every gathering. The one who received the wrong date for brunch, the one left out of photo collages, the one introduced as retired military with a tone that hinted I'd outlived my relevance. Nathan at first pushed back. He still sent me videos of his dog, called on my birthday, asked about my health. But over time the calls slowed. The messages became shorter. He started saying things like, "Alyssa thinks maybe it's better if we keep things simple this holiday," or "she just wants to avoid tension." I became the tension. And when Raymond got sick, Nathan visited more often, but always alone. Alyssa never stepped foot in our house again. Said it was too cluttered, too old. Said it smelled like a time that's passed. Raymond never commented. But on one of his last good days, he reached for my hand and said, "Promise me something." I leaned in. "Don't let them rewrite who you are." I nodded, thinking I understood. But I didn't. Not yet. That moment would haunt me weeks later as I stood in the rain outside his funeral, denied entry by the son we raised. I could hear the hymns through the walls. I knew every line. I had helped pick them. And yet I wasn't part of it. Not in their version. To them, I was the story better left untold. The complication in a perfect goodbye. But I stood there still and silent, the rain sliding down the brim of my cap, my back straight, my breath steady. Because someone had to remember the truth. Someone had to remember that before I was excluded, I was brave. Before I was erased, I had led. Before I was forgotten, I had saved lives. They didn't know. They never asked. And now they never would. But I remembered. And that had to be enough. For now. After retirement, I didn't expect to feel adrift. I thought I'd finally rest beside the man I loved, maybe plant tomatoes like we talked about, take long walks, or volunteer at the VA. But then Raymond's diagnosis came. Fast-moving cruel. By the time it was over, I was already drifting through a world that barely remembered I was ever a part of it. Nathan offered, or maybe suggested, I'm not even sure anymore, that I move in with him and Alyssa for a while after the funeral. "Oh, it'll be easier," he said. "You won't be alone. We've got the guest suite, it's practically its own apartment." His voice had that hurried, nervous tone, like he was trying to do the right thing while already regretting the offer. I accepted. Not because I needed a place to stay, but because I was too numb to think of what came next. The first few weeks I stayed out of their way. I woke early, made coffee, kept to myself. I noticed Alyssa started avoiding the kitchen at breakfast. The one morning I tried making pancakes the way I used to when Nathan was a boy. She walked in, sniffed the air, and said, "Oh, that's a lot of butter." I stopped cooking after that. Then came the rules. Not spoken directly, never that bold. They came in comments like, "Mom, Alyssa needs the living room for her shoot today," or "We're having guests from her networking group. Maybe it's better if you read upstairs," or "the one that cut deepest." "You don't have to clean, but if you could just make sure the dishes are out of the frame, that'd be great." Their house was all white walls and curated stillness. Not a picture out of place. Not a sound past 8 p.m. It felt more like a hotel lobby than a home. I tried to find space in it, carve out some corner where I belonged. But no matter where I stood, I was always in the way. One afternoon, I walked past Alyssa's open office door. She was on the phone, her voice low but unmistakably irritated. "She's just here to babysit Nate," she said. "I can't have her in my lifestyle photos. It ruins the aesthetic." I stopped in my tracks. Not angry. Just stunned. Like being splashed with cold water after waking from a dream. She saw me a few seconds later. Her face didn't even change. She just turned the door and shut it gently. That was the moment I realized in this house, I wasn't a guest. I wasn't family. I was furniture. Convenient when needed, hidden when not. Nathan didn't say anything about it. Not then, not ever. Over time, his words to me became shorter. "Yeah, Mom. Okay, Mom. Let me ask Alyssa." His eyes flicked to her whenever I spoke like he needed permission to respond. So one morning I packed 2 bags and told him I'd found a small apartment not far from the city center. I said I needed space. Time to breathe. He nodded slowly, then said the one thing that confirmed everything I already suspected. "If that's what Alyssa thinks is best, not if that's what you want, or are you sure you'll be okay, but what Alyssa thought." I left quietly. No drama, no confrontation. Just me and 2 bags and the echo of being slowly erased from the life I helped build. The apartment was small but warm. 2nd floor, creaky stairs. Good sunlight in the afternoon. I didn't have much furniture, but I filled the shelves with my old military books. Photos of Raymond, little souvenirs from deployments that I never unpacked before. It felt like mine in a way their house never had. Then the first red flag arrived, folded neatly in an envelope from my bank. An alert about a transfer I didn't authorize. A significant one. Not massive, but enough to make me pause. I called the customer service number and waited on hold for 30 minutes. When I finally spoke to someone, they asked if I'd added any joint account holders recently. I hadn't. When I brought it up to Nathan, because of course I still trusted him, he didn't even look surprised. Just shrugged and said, "Probably just a technical glitch. Let me check on it for you." "Do you have access to my accounts?" I asked, confused. "Well, we set up some shared permissions a while back. Remember when Dad got sick? You asked me to help with bills. Remember I didn't. Or maybe I had in the chaos of that year. Maybe I'd signed something without thinking, too tired to comb through the fine print. He offered to take care of it. Said he'd call the bank the next day. Days passed. Then weeks. No follow-up, no updates. And slowly I felt it again. That sinking feeling in my gut. The same one I'd felt on deployment when something wasn't quite right, but no one could name it yet. Still, I told myself it was nothing. A mix-up, a delayed transfer, a software error. Because the alternative, that my own son might be hiding something from me, was a truth I wasn't ready to look in the eye. Not yet. The morning after the funeral, I sat alone in my small apartment, the silence pressing down like a weight I couldn't lift. My uniform still hung neatly on the back of the chair ribbons and medals catching the weak morning light through the window. I hadn't had the strength to put it away. Maybe I needed to see it there, a reminder of who I still was underneath the grief and the ache. I made a cup of coffee I didn't really want and opened my laptop out of habit. A few unread emails, a couple of messages from former colleagues offering quiet condolences. I scrolled through without really reading, until a notification popped up from my retirement fund. The subject line read, "Urgent Account Activity Alert." At first I thought it might be a phishing scam, but the logo was correct. The address checked out. I clicked. The balance hit me like a fist. Nearly empty. Funds withdrawn over time in a pattern so subtle I hadn't noticed. I blinked, refreshed the page, opened the transaction history. Small transfers starting 6 years ago. $250 here, $400 there. Then gradually the amounts grew. $1,000, $3,000, until finally lump sums. Each entry stamped with calm regularity. And then I saw the recipient name linked to most of them, Stratus Concepts LLC. The name sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it at first. I ran a quick search. It was Nathan's company. I stared at the screen, my heart thudding in my chest like boots on hard pavement. My hands went cold. No, this had to be a mistake. Maybe it was an old shared account from when Raymond was sick. Maybe Nathan had used my info to pay a bill or cover something small. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down I already knew this wasn't a single oversight. This was a system, a siphon running quietly in the background while I was on deployments and training, visiting veterans' homes, folding flags over caskets. While I was serving, I called the bank, my voice steady but low. They transferred me to a fraud specialist. We went through the records together line by line. The woman on the phone was professional calm. She asked if I had authorized these transactions. I said no. She asked if I had ever shared my login credentials. I said no. She asked if anyone had power of attorney. I paused. There it was. 6 years ago, during Raymond's second hospital stay, Nathan had offered to handle the paperwork so I could focus on his care. I had signed a limited financial POA, meant only for medical billing as far as I understood. Do you have a copy of that authorization? The bank rep asked. No, I said quietly, but I think I know who does. I hung up and sat there in the dim morning light, the cursor on the screen blinking like a pulse. All this time I thought he had just been pulled away by his wife's world, that maybe he was too busy, too pressured to make room for me anymore. But this wasn't neglect. This was betrayal, and not just from Alyssa. Nathan had made the choice. My son, the boy I held through night fevers, who used to sit on the front porch waiting for me to return from base, who once ran down the terminal to meet me when I surprised him after a 6-month tour. He had done this. He hadn't just let his wife cut me out of their lives. He had used me to fund it. The gym memberships, the wine tastings, the curated house, the influencer career. All of it. With my money. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. But I felt something sharper than either. Clarity. That evening I called Dana, an old friend from my early days in the service. She had retired 5 years ago now, working in cybersecurity. She picked up on the second ring. Colleen, I need your help, I said. She didn't ask why. She just said, say when. Over the next few hours, Dana helped me secure my accounts, change passwords, lock access, freeze transfers. Then, in the quiet pause between steps, she asked, why didn't you notice sooner? I stared at the ceiling, then said softly, because I wanted to believe my son still saw me as his mother. She didn't reply right away. Then, with the quiet firmness of someone who knew me long before titles and medals, she said, Colleen, you wouldn't let a breach go unnoticed in the field. Don't ignore this one either. Her words sat heavy in my chest. She was right. I had spent a lifetime spotting threats before they exploded, reading silence like a language, calculating risks in split seconds. But when it came to my own family, I had been blind. Or maybe just unwilling to see. That ended now. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to plead. I wasn't even going to demand an apology. I was going to handle this like an officer. Not out of vengeance, but out of respect. For myself, for Raymond, for the years I spent standing between danger and the people I loved. Nathan may have seen me as expendable, but I knew better. And now I was going to act like it. The day I decided to open the cedar chest, the one Raymond made me promise I'd never throw out, I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for clarity. I had spent the last 2 nights staring at the ceiling, too numb to cry, too exhausted to sleep. My body ached in that way it used to after long deployments. Except this time there was no flak jacket, no combat boots, no enemy in sight. Just a silence that settled in my bones like ash. But I knew something had shifted. I could feel it in the stillness of my apartment, in the way I reached for the kettle in the morning and paused halfway as if waiting for orders that wouldn't come. I'd spent decades being the one others looked to in a crisis. Steady hands, calm voice, a mind that didn't panic. And here I was alone, betrayed, and nearly broke. I needed to move. I needed a plan. So I opened the chest. It sat at the foot of my bed untouched for years. The wood was darker now, worn at the corners, but it still smelled faintly of cedar and memory. Inside, folded with reverence, were the mementos of a life spent in service. Medals, campaign ribbons, citations from officers long retired or buried. I lifted them gently one by one. They didn't sparkle. They didn't feel like victory. They felt like weight, earned heavy and mine. But it wasn't the medals I was after. Beneath them, wrapped in a worn green folder tied with twine, were the documents I had quietly kept for decades. Bank papers, handwritten notes, duplicate account forms, things Raymond and I once called our fireproof records. He had insisted we keep physical backups just in case. I used to tease him for being old-fashioned. Now I was grateful. I sat at the kitchen table and began reading through each page. There it was. Proof of our joint accounts, our retirement planning, the savings bonds, the safe deposit box we once used for birth certificates and deployment records. I even found a list of original authorized signers with signatures all dated and notarized. Nathan's name wasn't on any of it. Neither was Alyssa's. I found an old letter Raymond had tucked into a file labeled, "In case you ever doubt yourself." His handwriting had softened over the years, but the words still carried his voice. If something ever happens, Colleen, don't let them make you feel small. You've seen more done, more led, more than most people will ever dream. If anyone ever tries to take that from you, don't yell. Just outthink them. That letter broke something open inside me. Not the kind of break that leaves you shattered, but the kind that clears fog. I knew what I needed to do. The next morning I reached out to the one person I trusted with things like this, Elena Ruiz. We'd served together years ago. She and Jagme still in active command. She'd helped me clean up a legal mess overseas that could have ended my career, and she did it without once making me feel like I was the problem. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called, she picked up on the second ring. "Colonel Larkin," she said, using my rank the way old comrades do. "What's going on?" "I need to talk," I said. "Face to face." She didn't hesitate. "Come by tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you've got." I arrived with the green folder, the bank notices, and the last 4 statements from my retirement account. Elena greeted me with a hug, then motioned me into a tidy office lined with books and framed commendations. There was no small talk. As I laid out the documents, she skimmed each one with growing concern. When I finished walking her through the pattern of transfers and Nathan's dismissive responses, she leaned back and exhaled slowly. "This isn't just a family misunderstanding," she said. "This is fraud. Premeditated, repetitive, strategic." She tapped one document. "This signature isn't yours." "I never signed that," I said. "Then we've got forgery on top of unauthorized access." She stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a business card. "You need someone who can go deeper. I know a forensic accountant, retired military, discreet, brilliant. His name is Marcus Bennett. I met Marcus 2 days later in a small office above a print shop downtown. He looked exactly like the kind of person who would notice if a decimal point was out of place. Thin, wire-rimmed glasses, methodical in every movement. He didn't ask personal questions, he asked for numbers. I gave him everything. The green folder, the bank printouts, access to my online accounts. He nodded once and said, "Give me 3 days." He called me after 2. "I'm going to need you to come in," he said. "Bring a notepad." When I arrived, he had 2 monitors open, each displaying a web of transactions. One line highlighted in red moved from my retirement fund into a business account under N&A Consulting LLC. "That's them," I said. He nodded. What they did was subtle. Started with microtransfers, $200 here, $500 there, classified as management fees or family reinvestment. But over 6 years it built into something substantial. When you moved out and gave Nathan partial access to your mail, they used that opportunity to update digital access to several of your accounts. I found a digital signature authorization form submitted using an outdated email account they likely created for you. My stomach turned. So they set this up years ago. At least 6, he said, but they escalated it heavily in the last 2 years, likely tied to that new house they bought. Paid for with my future, I murmured. He didn't offer platitudes, just facts. The good news, he said, is I can trace every dollar, and I've prepared a certified financial report documenting all of it. With Elena's help, you'll have a rock-solid legal position, should you choose to pursue it. I looked at the report, over 140 pages, color-coded, time-stamped, notarized. I don't want to destroy them, I said. I want the truth to be undeniable. He nodded. That's exactly what this is. Elena reviewed the report and prepared an affidavit detailing the unauthorized activity. She drafted a formal letter. Calm, precise, stating the facts, the consequences, and the options moving forward. She asked, "Do you want this sent to them?" "Not yet," I said. I needed time. Not to plot revenge. To remember who I was before they made me feel invisible. That night I returned home and opened the chest again. I didn't take out the medals. I took out the letter from Raymond, the one about not letting others shrink me. I placed it beside Marcus's report. Side by side, the love of someone who always believed in me, and the evidence of those who didn't. And that was enough. For now. Because I wasn't here to fight fire with fire, I was here to build something no flame could touch. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. There's a certain discipline that never leaves you even long after the uniform is folded away. You learn how to plan a mission in layers. Front-facing strategy contingency routes, quiet reserves in case things go wrong. You learn how to prepare for betrayal. And you learn that no action is more powerful than the one carried out in complete silence, backed by truth and timing. That's how I approached what came next. I started with a binder. Not digital folders, not cloud storage. Paper tabs printed evidence. A system I could see with my eyes, feel with my hands. One section for forged authorizations, one for bank transfers, one for legal contacts. I labeled every page. I didn't rush. I treated it like a mission brief, because that's what it was. I'd been wrong once thinking Nathan's distance was just emotional. I wouldn't make that mistake again. Elena and Marcus had given me everything I needed. A forensic financial report expert, affidavits, digital trails, and a legal analysis that made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was calculated manipulation. But there was still one piece missing, one that Raymond had trusted to stay buried until it mattered his will. It had always been straightforward. I remember when we signed it together in a cramped notary office, both still in our final year of service. "No surprises," Raymond said. "If anything happens, you get it all. You manage everything. Simple." But something had changed after his death. Nathan had submitted a new will to probate, one that placed him and Alyssa as co-executors, giving them full authority over the family estate. I hadn't seen it until the funeral, when the estate lawyer handed me a copy with an awkward smile and said, "I believe you'll want to review this, ma'am." It had been signed 3 days after Raymond passed. I stared at the signature. It wasn't forged technically, but it wasn't Raymond's either. Not really. It was shaky, uncertain, barely legible. That wasn't how he wrote. That wasn't how he did anything. So I went back. Elena and I pulled the original will from storage. Dated 4 years prior, filed with a different attorney, still legally binding. In it, I was the sole executor, the named beneficiary, and the designated custodian of all financial accounts and property assets. Raymond hadn't changed it. Nathan had. Using his access, his influence, his assumption that I'd be too tired or too broken to question anything, he'd pushed a new document into place. It was signed, notarized, and submitted, but under deeply questionable circumstances. A notary who claimed to have witnessed the signing refused to answer follow-up questions. The medical condition listed on Raymond's hospice report made it clear he was heavily medicated in those final days. There were gaps, too many to ignore. Elena sat across from me in her office, flipping through both wills. This one, she said, pointing to the original, is airtight. The only reason the new one was processed is because you didn't contest it. But now that we have evidence of diminished capacity and a previous version on record, we can move to revoke it. She looked at me calm but direct. Are you ready for what comes next? I didn't answer right away. I looked down at the page. Raymond's signature in blue ink, clean and steady, and felt a familiar steadiness settle over me. Yes, I said. We filed the motion the following week. Courtrooms aren't like TV. There are no outbursts, no dramatic music, no thunderclaps of revelation. Just documents, just facts, just the ticking of a clock and the rustle of paper as a judge reads silently. Nathan wasn't in the room when we submitted the motion. Neither was Alyssa, their attorney, a thin, nervous man who kept checking his phone, accepted the paperwork with a tight smile and a few polite nods. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The evidence said everything. We argued for reinstatement of the original will, citing Raymond's mental incapacity during the creation of the second version. Inconsistencies in the notary records and digital logs showing the revised document had been uploaded from Nathan's home IP address. 3 days later, we stood outside the courthouse waiting for the clerk to finish filing the final paperwork. The autumn air was crisp, dry leaves blowing across the sidewalk. People passed us by busy with their lives, unaware of the quiet storm that had just shifted course. I stood there holding my copy of the reinstated will, watching the sun slip behind the buildings. And I didn't say a word. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't need to anymore. Raymond had always told me, you don't win by shouting louder. You win by standing longer. And I was still standing. As we stepped off the courthouse steps, Elena touched my arm. Do you want to call him? She asked. No, I said simply. She didn't ask why. Because some victories aren't announcements. They're moments of return. Return to truth. To dignity. To the version of yourself they tried to erase but couldn't. I tucked the documents into my briefcase, nodded once, and said what I hadn't said in years. Not to anyone, not even myself. It's time. The morning of the memorial was colder than I expected, one of those sharp, bone-deep mornings where even the sunlight seems reluctant. I woke early, made coffee out of habit, and sat at the small kitchen table with the folded invitation in front of me. It wasn't addressed to me. I had only found out about the event from one of Raymond's old unit members who'd seen it mentioned online. A remembrance service organized by Nathan and Alyssa. My name was nowhere on the flyer. I stared at the paper, the cheap stock and clean fonts that said everything without saying much. No mention of Raymond's decades in uniform. No trace of the Marine who had once carried wounded men across the desert under enemy fire. No hint of the woman he came home to who knew the weight of silence, of duty, of loyalty. I wore my dress blues. Not to make a statement, not even for them. I wore them for him. Every stripe, every ribbon, every medal carefully pinned and aligned. I had folded these away after my final retirement ceremony, thinking I'd never wear them again. But today wasn't about closure. It was about remembrance. And I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite the past. Not today. The church was in the hills just outside town. White stone, wide steps. The kind of place Raymond would have liked. Modest, dignified, surrounded by trees rather than marble. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw the cars lined up, people streaming toward the chapel doors. Friends of the family, I guessed. Business associates of Nathan's. Alyssa's polished circle. I parked far in the back. It felt symbolic somehow. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked. The cold wind whipped at the edge of my uniform coat, but I didn't waver. I walked upright, every step deliberate. Some people turned to look. Most didn't recognize me. Some looked twice. At the medals, the uniform, the posture, they didn't expect from the estranged mother. I reached the foot of the church steps. Alyssa saw me first. She descended the stairs in her black designer coat, not a hair out of place. Her expression didn't even try to hide it. Disdain, discomfort, calculation. She stepped in front of me like a wall with lipstick. "You're not welcome here, Colleen," she said, cool and quiet. "This is a private event. For family." I looked at her without speaking. She didn't flinch. She didn't expect me to argue. She expected me to shrink, to turn away like I had so many times before. I didn't. Behind me, the sound came. Sharp, rhythmic, unmistakable. Boots. 12 pairs of highly polished leather striking the pavement in perfect cadence. It echoed down the long stretch of the parking lot like thunder gathering in formation. Heads turned. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. A couple of older veterans instinctively straightened up. Alyssa's face tightened. The 12 Marines came into view, moving as one. Their uniforms were impeccable, their steps timed down to the millisecond. At the front was a man I hadn't seen in over a decade. General Thomas Greer. Silver-haired now, but with the same steel in his shoulders. We had served together briefly years ago. I hadn't called him. I hadn't asked anyone to come. But he had heard. When they reached the base of the stairs, the Marines halted as one. General Greer removed his cover, held it against his chest, and turned to face me fully. "Lieutenant General Colleen Barrett, ma'am," he said, his voice cutting clean through the morning air. "We are here to honor your husband's service. And yours." It was quiet then, so quiet that even the wind seemed to pause. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I saw Nathan now standing just inside the church doors. His eyes widened when he saw the formation. He looked from me to General Greer to the 12 Marines behind him. Then he looked at Alyssa. She stepped back. She didn't say another word. The crowd near the steps began to shift. Some looked at me for the first time with recognition, some with confusion, others with something that almost resembled guilt. A few of Raymond's fellow Marines, older now jackets weighed down with pins and ribbons, nodded once in my direction, slow and solemn. I returned the salute with precise form. My hand cut the air just as I had done hundreds of times before. But this time it meant more than any ceremony I'd ever attended. This wasn't for rank. It was for remembrance. For a man they tried to bury in silence. For the life we'd shared that no one else had the right to erase. General Greer stepped beside me. "Raymond always said you were the better officer," he murmured just loud enough for me to hear. "Said you had more backbone than any man he'd ever met." I didn't smile, but I felt something settle in my chest, something heavy, but not painful. From the crowd, a voice whispered, "Who is she?" Another answered, "She's his wife, the one they said wasn't coming." I stayed silent. Alyssa disappeared into the chapel. Nathan didn't follow her. The Marines turned as one, and with General Greer still beside me, they began to walk. Not into the church, but around the side toward the flag-draped memorial stone that had been set up beneath the oak tree where Raymond once liked to sit. The real tribute wasn't happening at the pulpit. It was happening there, in the open air, in full view of everyone who had once ignored me. I followed them. The crowd followed me. No one asked where I was going. No one stopped me. The silence that trailed us said everything they were too ashamed to speak. At the memorial site, the Marines formed a tight semicircle. General Greer read the citation for Raymond's final commendation. A younger Marine played taps. I stood motionless, hands folded behind my back. When it ended, no one clapped. No one needed to. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, not from absence, but from presence too large to ignore. Someone handed me the folded flag. Someone whispered, "You belong here." I didn't nod. I simply turned and walked back down the hill, medals clinking softly in rhythm with each step. I had been shut out, dismissed, reduced to a footnote in my own life. But today, without raising my voice or demanding a thing, the truth stepped into the light and stood in formation beside me. They had tried to define me by absence, but the world had just seen what presence really looks like. And it looked a lot like 12 polished boots, and a woman who never needed permission to stand her ground. The air outside the chapel felt different now, charged but quieter, as if the ground itself was waiting to hear what came next. The military tribute had ended. The crowd had started to shift uneasily, unsure whether to head back inside or follow what they instinctively knew was no longer inside the church. But out here where something real had just happened. I didn't rush. I stood beneath the old oak tree holding the folded flag against my chest, letting its familiar weight steady my breath. It had always grounded me. Cloth that once flew high above every base we served on, stitched by hands that believed in things bigger than themselves. General Greer had already left nodding to me quietly before leading his men back to their transport. He didn't need to say anything more. What he had done by showing up said everything. But it wasn't over. There was still one thing left to do. Behind me, I heard the quiet creak of leather shoes on chapel steps, followed by the clearing of a throat. I turned to see Elena walking forward, a thick folder in her arms. Her eyes met mine. She gave a small nod. It was time. The murmurs began before she reached the stone path. "Is that a lawyer? What's she doing here? Who is she with?" Elena ignored them. She walked with the same calm, deliberate grace she had shown in every courtroom, every briefing room where we'd once defended the rights of those the system preferred to forget. She climbed the chapel steps. Not to enter, but to stand squarely on the landing in full view of the gathering. The crowd had begun to reassemble near the entrance, uncertain, pulled between two versions of the story they'd been told. The version in the program, and the one unfolding right before their eyes. Elena opened the folder and held up a document. Her voice when it came was strong and clear. No microphone needed. "I am here today on behalf of the late Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Barrett and, more importantly, his legal spouse and appointed executor, Lieutenant General Colleen Barrett." There was a ripple in the crowd, not quite shock, but tension like glass stretching before it cracks. "This," she continued, holding the page higher, "is the original notarized will signed by Colonel Barrett before his illness. It names General Barrett as sole executor and grants her full authority over all assets, property, and designated memorial arrangements." She paused. "And as of this moment, this document has been reinstated as the binding legal directive governing his estate, having been improperly replaced posthumously under questionable circumstances, now formally challenged and reversed." A hush fell. Not a stunned silence, but the kind that comes from collective breath being held. I scanned the faces before me. Nathan was frozen halfway down the steps. Alyssa stood beside him, her jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles twitch from across the lawn. Her fingers dug into the sleeve of his coat, but he didn't respond. His face was drained of color. Behind them stood the cluster of relatives and family friends who had aligned themselves, however subtly, with the version of events Alyssa curated. The ones who had smiled politely when I walked in, only to look away as soon as my back turned. The ones who never asked where I'd gone, or why. They were shifting now, eyes darting to one another, trying to gauge what this meant, what they had missed, what they had followed blindly. No one spoke, and that was the difference. If I had walked up those stairs and shouted, they would have dismissed me as bitter. If I had interrupted the service and demanded the truth, they would have called me unstable. But I hadn't said a word. Not when they excluded me. Not when they spent what was mine. Not when they buried Raymond without me. I had let the truth do the speaking, and now it stood on church steps in black ink and seal. Elena closed the folder and said one final thing. The memorial site under the oak tree, which General Barrett chose and funded personally, was designated by the deceased as his preferred location for remembrance. All future tributes and honors will be conducted in accordance with the terms of this document. Then she stepped down and rejoined me, handing me the folder with quiet finality. From behind, I heard someone whisper, "She never raised her voice." But she changed the room. I didn't react. But those words lodged deep inside me not as pride, but as truth finally recognized. My eyes found Nathan's again. He looked at me now. Not in anger, not even in guilt, but something far more complicated. Realization. He hadn't just lost a case. He had lost the illusion. The one where he could reshape history with silence. The one where he could hide behind his wife's curated narratives. The one where the mother he tried to erase wouldn't notice. He blinked and looked away. Alyssa pulled his arm sharply, but he didn't move. The people around them began to disperse, no longer anchored to their story. A few came toward me, old friends of Raymond's retired servicemen neighbors. No one apologized. They didn't have to. Their faces said enough. I offered small nods, shook a few hands, accepted folded programs I hadn't been meant to receive, and then I stepped back from the crowd and walked toward the memorial stone. It was simple, just like Raymond would have wanted. His name, his rank, the dates of his birth and death, and beneath it a single line: "He served with honor. She stood with strength." I laid the folder at the base of the stone. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because for the first time since all of this began, there was nothing left to explain. No more justifying, no more pleading to be understood. The war wasn't fought with weapons this time. It was fought with silence, with proof, with presence. And I had won. Not by overpowering them, but by outlasting every lie they'd told in my absence. I had stood where they said I didn't belong, and made the truth undeniable, without shouting, without rage, just a woman in uniform holding the line. The days after the memorial were quieter than I expected. Not hollow, not heavy. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after a long storm. Not because everything is over, but because you've finally reached the part where you can breathe again. I didn't go to the press. I didn't pursue criminal charges. I had enough to fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of a senior. A lawyer like Elena could have buried them in litigation until the only thing left was paperwork and regret. But I didn't want to punish them. I wanted distance. I wanted peace. I wanted my life back without the noise of courtrooms or headlines or more people telling my story for me. So, through Elena, I made a simple offer they would withdraw from every asset: the house, the accounts, the business ventures funded with my money, everything. In return, I wouldn't take it further. It wasn't forgiveness. It was resolution. Nathan signed without a word. Alyssa never responded to the letter at all. I didn't expect gratitude. I certainly didn't get an apology. But the silence this time felt like something had finally ended. With the funds returned, I could have done anything. Traveled, upgraded the apartment, disappeared to the coast and never looked back. Instead, I did something smaller. Something that mattered. I opened a coffee shop. Not the Instagram kind with neon signs and expensive croissants. Just a small space 2 blocks from the VA clinic near the bus stop, tucked between a laundromat and a pharmacy. The kind of place people pass without noticing. I called it the Morning Line. It didn't open at noon or serve oat milk lattes. It opened at 6 a.m. It served drip coffee, 2 kinds of muffins, and a promise veterans and the unhoused got everything free until noon. No questions, no stares, no ID checks, just warmth. Some days we saw 5 people, some days 20. Word spread quietly. Former Marines, retired Army medics, a woman who had driven fuel trucks in Afghanistan, men who slept in their cars, women who hadn't spoken in weeks until someone offered them a donut and a seat. They came not just for the coffee. They came because the walls didn't ask who they were, because someone behind the counter remembered what silence meant when it wasn't chosen. I didn't hang my medals on the wall. I didn't put up a photo of me in uniform. I wore jeans and rolled up sleeves and brewed coffee like anyone else. But some people knew, the first time one of the 12 Marines walked in. Miles, I think his name was. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped a tray. "You bake?" I asked. Badly, he replied, grinning. But I take direction. They started coming every weekend. Not in uniform, not with fanfare, just a rotation of young men who remembered that service wasn't always war. Sometimes it was dishes and sweeping and listening to someone's story for the third time. On Saturdays, one of them brought his teenage daughter to help. On Sundays, they taught a homeless vet how to knead dough. We never said it was a mission, but everyone knew it was. One morning I was restocking the sugar when an older man walked in. He had a limp and wore a ball cap pulled low over his eyes. I didn't recognize him at first. He sat at the corner stool, looked around the shop, and smiled like it hurt. "You probably don't remember me," he said. I studied his face. "Help me out. Kandahar. Civilian evac. You pulled me and my son from a collapsed building. I couldn't walk. You carried me like I weighed nothing." I did remember. Not his name, but his face, younger, dirt-smudged, terrified. He looked around again. "They tried to erase you," he said softly. "But ma'am, you showed up." I didn't reply, just poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. That moment stayed with me for days. Because that's what it was about, really. Not the ceremony, not the will, not the final word in a family argument. It was about showing up, about refusing to be erased not by fighting, but by returning, over and over, to serve again, to choose usefulness over bitterness, to build instead of burn. One afternoon I stayed late to clean up. The shop had emptied. The light from the front window hit the countertop just right, and I saw a smudge in the shape of a child's hand. One of the Marines' kids had been coloring on the counter that morning. I didn't wipe it away. I stood there a long while, apron dusted with flour, arms sore from lifting crates, and felt something I hadn't in years. Settled. Not victorious, not proud. Just at peace. Because while some people spend their whole lives chasing honor, I had learned something different. I wasn't there to be honored. I was there to serve. Again. The letter arrived in early spring. I almost didn't open it. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, no markings beyond my name written in familiar handwriting I hadn't seen in months. My hand hesitated over the tear. Part of me unsure if it was too late to care, another part afraid it wasn't. I made tea instead. Let it sit. Watched the sun crawl across the counter before finally sitting down, steadying my breath like I used to before a mission briefing and sliding my finger beneath the seal. There was only one page, folded in thirds, no stationery, just plain lined paper, and his words written with pauses as if every sentence cost him more than he'd expected. "Mom, I don't expect this to fix anything. I don't know if it should. But I need to say this, I was wrong. Not just about the money or the will or the memorial. About you. I spent so long thinking you were made of stone, that you didn't feel the things we did because you didn't cry like us, didn't soften like other moms. I told myself you were too proud, too cold, too distant. But I was the one who built the distance. You didn't fail us. I failed you. Alyssa said you were intimidating. I think now what she meant was you reminded her of everything she wasn't. I watched 12 Marines march for you and realized I'd never asked who you were before you were my mother, or who you still were long after. You deserved better from me. From all of us. You won't hear from me again unless you want to. I won't intrude. But I needed you to know. I see it now. Nathan. I sat there for a long time, eyes tracing the words, not reading them so much as measuring them. It wasn't a public apology. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was just a man trying to face himself through a letter. And I respected that more than anything he could have said in a courtroom or behind a podium. Still, I didn't cry. I folded the letter carefully, ran my palm across it once, and placed it in the drawer of the sideboard where I kept unsent postcards, old keys, and one photograph of Raymond no one else had ever seen. Not to hold on to it, not to reopen it later, just to close it properly. Some things don't need to be forgiven out loud. Some pain doesn't need an audience to be released. I didn't need Nathan to call me mother again. I didn't need Alyssa's approval or the neighbor's understanding or even the satisfaction of being proven right, because somewhere along the way, I had stopped waiting to be seen. And I had started choosing to see myself. The morning line was quiet that day. Tuesdays always were. The regulars had come and gone. Miles had baked too many blueberry muffins again. One of the Marines had fixed the back fence over the weekend. The smell of cinnamon and coffee still hung in the air. I wiped the last table, unlocked the front door, and stepped outside. The morning light was soft, gentler than the cold blaze of winter, but not yet the warmth of summer. Somewhere down the block, someone was mowing a lawn. Birds chirped from the wires overhead. I leaned on the porch railing and watched the day wake up. There was no ceremony. No ribbon to cut. No applause. Just the quiet breath of a life rebuilt on steadiness instead of scars. Across the street, a man in a tattered coat shuffled by with a thermos we'd filled earlier. He raised it in thanks. I waved back, and that was enough. It had been a long road, longer than any deployment I'd served, not because of distance, but because of what it asked me to carry. The kind of grief that has no funeral, the kind of strength no one salutes. But I carried it. And now I could set it down. Not in bitterness, not in vengeance, just in peace. Because the truth is, I never needed the world to understand me. I just needed to stop trying to explain myself to those who never listened. I had been a daughter, a soldier, a mother, a widow. I had been left out, pushed aside, underestimated. And yet, I had returned, not to reclaim a title, but to rewrite the story, on my own terms. He tried to define me once, but I've already written my name. If you've made it this far, maybe some part of this story echoed something in your own life. Being left out, misunderstood, or quietly standing alone in a moment you never thought would come. Have you ever felt erased by the very people you once put first? Have you ever chosen peace over proving a point, even when you knew you were right? If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know. Did any part of Colleen's journey reflect your own? And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, of quiet strength, of sacrifice, of women reclaiming their worth, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There's so much more to come and you won't want to miss it. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stand her ground in silence.